On this edition of Crime Chronicles, I come to you from Fall River, Massachusetts. Behind me is a location where one of the most famous murders of the 19th century occurred. In this episode, we take a look at the trial of Lizzie Borden. Fall River, Massachusetts is a town now about 95,000 people, I think, about an hour from Boston and just across the Rhode Island state line. It's a blue-collar town and heavily influenced by immigrants to this day, and such was the case back in the 19th century when this murder occurred. It occurred during the Victorian era, and one of the things that lent a lot of publicity and a lot of infamy to this case was the fact that sensational journalism, or sensationalistic journalism, as we take for granted now, was in its infancy at the time. So it was a crime that shocked Victorian morality in the United States, and particularly with the chief suspect was a upper-class, prim and proper spinster, they would call then, a single woman who was accused of brutally murdering her father and stepmother.
Lizzie Andrew Borden was born on July 19, 1860, in Fall River, Massachusetts, to Sarah Anthony Borden and Andrew Jackson Borden. Andrew Borden grew up in very modest surroundings and struggled financially as a young man, despite being the descendant of wealthy and influential local residents. He married Sarah Morse in 1846. Andrew eventually prospered in the manufacture and sale of furniture and caskets, then became a successful property developer. He was a director of several textile mills and owned considerable commercial property. He was also president of the Union Savings Bank and a director of Durfee Safe Deposit and Trust Company. The Borden house stood in an affluent area, but the wealthiest residents of Fall River, including Andrew's cousins, generally lived in the more fashionable neighborhood, or the Hill, which was farther away from the town's industrial area. Lizzie and her older sister Emma had a Protestant upbringing and attended Central Congregational Church. Lizzie was involved in religious organizations such as the Christian Endeavor Society, for which she served as secretary-treasurer, and she was a member of the Ladies' Fruit and Flower Mission. Sarah Morse Borden died in 1863. 3 years after Sarah's death, Andrew married Abby Gray. Lizzie later stated that she called her stepmother Mrs. Borden, and the two did not have a cordial relationship. Lizzie believed that Abby had married her father for his wealth. It was reported that Lizzie and Emma seldom dined with their father and stepmother.
Lizzie Borden took an axe, gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41.
Lizzie Borden took an axe and gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, she gave her father 41. Such was a popular nursery rhyme in the 19th century as a result of the Lizzie Borden case. Now, there are a few inaccuracies and a couple of things that are debatable in that nursery rhyme. One is the fact that the woman who was killed was her stepmother and not her mother, and that was significant. Another thing was that there were not 40 whacks, but each person who was killed was administered about 8 to 10 whacks. As far as whether an axe was used, probably not. More than likely, the murder instrument was a hatchet, although a close cousin of an axe, of course. But the real question is did Lizzie Borden indeed kill her father and stepmother? That's what is debated to this day. What happened? On Thursday, August 4th, 1892, Andrew Borden and his second wife, Abby, were found murdered in the house across the street from me here. Him downstairs in the parlor and her upstairs in one of the bedrooms. Not her bedroom, not her stepdaughter's bedrooms, but the bedroom of a man who was staying with him temporarily, who actually was Lizzie Borden's maternal uncle from Andrew Borden's first marriage. The two had been bludgeoned to death, most likely with a hatchet. Each person's face, or actually in the case of Andrew Borden, his face was pretty much unrecognizable. It had been bludgeoned so much. As for Abby Borden, she was struck primarily in the back of the head from behind. Let's take a look at 5 people involved in this case, starting with Andrew Borden. Andrew Borden was a very well-to-do businessman here in Fall River. He was worth, as they say, in modern money, about, say, $14 million, so very well off. But he was also a spendthrift, or actually a cheapskate, some would call. In those days, the wealthier residents of a town like this could afford indoor plumbing, indoor toiletries, and amenities such as that, which are, of course, commonplace today. But because he was so cheap, Andrew Borden would not allow himself or his family to enjoy those amenities he could well afford. He was not particularly well liked in the town, but he was well respected and was well off. Now, his second wife was Abby. His first wife had died not long after giving birth to their second child, who also died as well. Abby Borden this was a marriage of convenience, really. She was middle-aged when they got married. He needed a wife to help him take care of the household and take care of the children and so forth, and she fulfilled that role. She was not very well liked by their 2 daughters, Abby and Emma. And so the next character here we're talking about is Emma Borden, the oldest daughter of the Borden family. Of course, conspiracy theorists naturally believed that she was the one who committed these murders, which is a foolish belief because it was documented she was out of town on the day that it happened. And then there was the Irish immigrant maid, Bridget Sullivan. Bridget Sullivan naturally came under suspicion, but it was discovered that she had an alibi herself. And then there's Lizzie Borden. Lizzie Borden was the youngest daughter of the Borden family, and while she was unmarried, and again called a spinster in those days, she was very active in the Fall River community. She taught Sunday school, she gave English lessons to Mandarin children, immigrants. She was involved in the Temperance Society, the Anti-Alcohol Society, which was pretty common in Massachusetts and throughout the country for that matter at the time. And for the most part, she was pretty well liked. Now, did this occur in the middle of the night? Hardly. It occurred in broad daylight, sometime around between 10 and 11 a.m. The first person to report the murders was Lizzie Borden herself. She told a neighbor that she had found her father bludgeoned to death, murdered. She didn't say bludgeoned to death, just murdered in the downstairs parlor. And upon further investigation, actually by the Irish maid who worked for the Bordens, Abby Borden's body was found upstairs in a bedroom, again face down in a puddle of blood.
On the morning of August 4th, Andrew, Abby, and Bridget Sullivan were at the house for breakfast. John Morris, Lizzie's maternal uncle, was also there, as he had spent the previous night at the house. After breakfast, Andrew Borden and John Morris went to the sitting room, where they chatted for nearly an hour. Morris left around 8:48 a.m. to buy a pair of oxen and visit another niece in Fall River, planning to return to the Borden home for lunch at noon. Andrew left for his morning walk sometime around 9 a.m. Although the cleaning of the guest room was one of Lizzie and Emma's regular chores, Abby went upstairs sometime between 9 and 10:30 a.m. to make the bed. According to the forensic investigation, Abby Borden was facing her killer at the time of the initial attack. She was first struck on the side of the head with a hatchet, which cut her just above the ear, causing her to turn and fall face down on the floor, creating contusions on her nose and her forehead. Her killer then struck her multiple times, delivering 17 more direct hits to the back of her head, killing her. When Andrew Borden returned around 10:30 a.m., his key failed to open the door, so he knocked. Bridget Sullivan went to unlock the door. Finding it jammed, she uttered a curse word. She would later testify that she heard Lizzie laughing immediately after this. She did not see Lizzie, but stated that the laughter was coming from the top of the stairs. This was considered significant, as Abby was already dead by this time, and her body would have been visible to anyone on the second floor. Lizzie later denied being upstairs and testified that her father had asked her where Abby was, to which she replied that a messenger had delivered Abby a summons to visit a sick friend. Bridget Sullivan stated that she had then removed Andrew's boots and helped him into his slippers before he lay down on the sofa for a nap. This detail is contradicted by the crime scene photos, which show Andrew wearing boots. She testified that she was in her third-floor room resting from cleaning windows when just before 11:10 a.m. she heard Lizzie call from downstairs, "Maggie, come quick. Father's dead. Somebody came in and killed him." Andrew was slumped on a couch in the downstairs sitting room, struck 10 or 11 times with a hatchet-like weapon. One of his eyes had been split cleanly in two, suggesting that he had been asleep when attacked. His still bleeding wounds suggested a very recent attack. Dr. Seabury Bowen, the family's physician, arrived from his home across the street and pronounced both victims dead. Detectives estimated that Andrew's death had occurred at approximately 11 a.m.
Now, on the surface, the Borden family may have appeared to be happy and normal, but they weren't really happy. It was well known that Abby Borden did not have a good relationship with her two stepdaughters, particularly Lizzie, and that their father was not the most agreeable man in the world either. But nevertheless, they weren't typically very abnormal, again, very well off. But there were problems in the relationships, and one was that Abby supposedly wanted more of her father's money. Was he really as cheap as people say? Well, there's some debate about that. He had funded a year of college for his older daughter, and he had sent Lizzie on some pretty expensive vacations, and he had decorated their rooms in the house pretty nice. But still, there were grown women living with their parents, and so problems arose. It was also a source of irritation when Lizzie, I should say, discovered that her father had purchased a home for the sister of her stepmother. She says, "Dad, you gave her a house, you gave me a nice room and a trip. That's not enough." So there were problems in the relationship. It was also speculated that Abby was trying to cut Lizzie out of the family will, and that may have caused some friction between them. And it even got to the point where there was some speculation that there was an improper relationship, if you will, between Abby and her father, although that most likely is discounted.
In May 1892, Andrew Borden killed several pigeons in his barn with a hatchet, believing they were attracting local children to hunt them. Lizzie had recently built a roost for the pigeons, and has been commonly recounted that she was upset over his killing of them, though the veracity of the story has been disputed. A family argument in July 1892 prompted Emma and Lizzie to take extended vacations in nearby New Bedford. After returning to Fall River a week before the murders, Lizzie stayed in a local rooming house for 4 days before returning to the Borden residence. Tension had been growing within the Borden family in the months before the murders, especially over Andrew's gifts of real estate to various branches of Abby's family. After their stepmother's sister received a house, the sisters demanded and received a rental property, the home they had lived in until their mother died, which they purchased from their father for $1. A few weeks before the murders, they sold the property back to their father for $5,000. About $170,000 today. The night before the murders, John Morris visited and was invited to stay for a few days to discuss business matters with Andrew, leading to speculation that their conversation, particularly about property transfer, may have aggravated an already tense situation.
Upon discovery of the two bodies, some townspeople immediately speculated that it must be some of the recent immigrants to Fall River who they didn't trust very much to begin with, and the town was plentiful with immigrants from all over the world, say from China, from Sweden, from Ireland, and from Portugal. And to this day, there's a large Portuguese community in Fall River. So was robbery the motive? Not likely, because nothing was taken. And so it didn't take long for authorities to zero in on Lizzie as the prime suspect.
Lizzie's initial answers to the police officers' questions were at times strange and contradictory. Initially, she reported hearing a groan or a scraping noise or a distress call before entering the house. 2 hours later, she told police she had heard nothing and entered the house not realizing that anything was wrong. When asked where her stepmother was, she recounted Abby receiving a note asking her to visit a sick friend. She also stated that she thought Abby had returned and asked if someone could go upstairs and look for her. Bridget Sullivan and a neighbor were halfway up the stairs, their eyes level with the floor, when they looked into the guest room and saw Abby lying face down on the floor. Most of the officers who interviewed Lizzie reported that they disliked her attitude. Some said she was too calm and too poised. Despite her behavior and changing alibis, she was not checked for bloodstains. Police did search her room, but it was a cursory inspection. At the trial, they admitted to not doing a proper search because Lizzie was not feeling well. They were subsequently criticized for their lack of diligence. In the basement, police found 2 hatchets, 2 axes, and a hatchet head with a broken handle. The hatchet head was suspected of being the murder weapon, as a break in the handle appeared fresh, and the ash and dust on the head, unlike that on the other bladed tools, appeared to have been deliberately applied to make it look as if it had been in the basement for some time. However, none of these tools were removed from the house. Because of the mysterious illness, probably accidental food poisoning, that had stricken the household before the murders, the family's milk and the victims' stomachs were removed and autopsied. The autopsies were performed in the Borden dining room and were tested for poison. None was found. Lizzie and Emma's friend, Alice Russell, decided to stay with the sisters the night following the murders. Police were stationed around the house on the night of August 4th, during which time an officer said he had seen Lizzie enter the cellar with Russell, carrying a kerosene lamp and a slop pail. He stated he saw both women exit the cellar, after which Lizzie returned alone, though he was unable to see what she was doing. He stated it appeared she was bent over the sink.
The news media of that day, which consisted solely of newspapers, ate this story up. It was shocking. I mean, why would the adult child of such an affluent family who had no prior criminal history, no indication that something like this would be in her behavior, commit such an act? Now, it was known around town that Lizzie Borden may have been somewhat of a kleptomaniac. She was accused of stealing quite a bit. But in any case, she never had any tendency toward violence or even mental illness. So the first step that was taken in the investigation was a coroner's inquest. Now, at the time of the coroner's inquest, Lizzie Borden was being heavily medicated, and that played a part in this case. She also did not have legal representation. Now, at the coroner's inquest, she made several incriminating statements, and that came back to haunt not her, but the prosecution when the case finally went to trial.
On August 6th, police conducted a more thorough search of the house, inspecting the sisters' clothing and confiscating the broken handle hatchet head. That evening, a police officer and Fall River Mayor John Coughlin visited the house, and Lizzie was informed that she was a suspect in the murders. At the coroner's inquest on August 8th, Lizzie requested the presence of her family attorney, but her request was refused under a state statute providing that an inquest must be held in private. Her testimony may have been affected by the morphine she was taking. Her behavior was erratic, and she often refused to answer a question even if the answer would benefit her. She often contradicted herself and provided alternating accounts of the morning in question, such as saying she was in the kitchen reading a magazine when her father arrived home, then saying she was in the dining room just doing some ironing, and then saying she was coming down the stairs. Newspaper accounts reported that the testimony provided in the inquest had caused a change of opinion among her friends who have heretofore strongly maintained her innocence. The inquest received significant press attention nationwide, including an extensive 3-page write-up in the Boston Globe. On August 11th, Lizzie was arrested and jailed in Taunton, where she would remain throughout her ordeal. A grand jury began hearing evidence on November 7th, and she was indicted on December 2nd, 4 months after the murders.
A few other things worth mentioning about the case. First off, the actual murder weapon was never firmly identified, let alone found. One has to remember that forensic science, forensic investigation was very primitive back in the 1890s compared to what it is today. In fact, hundreds of townspeople trampled on the crime scene, even as the bodies were inside the house. So the crime scene was completely corrupted. But investigations, such as they were, did take place. Another thing that was interesting was that it was alleged that Lizzie Borden went to a local pharmacist a day or two before and tried to buy some prussic acid, which was used for medicinal purposes, some cases, but it had to have a doctor's prescription. But this prussic acid was really cyanide. And so the pharmacist, who did not recognize Lizzie Borden, refused to give it to her because she didn't have a doctor's prescription. But several customers identified that woman as Andrew Borden's daughter, so that heightened suspicion about Lizzie Borden as well. It was also suspected, or at least it probably was confirmed, that some of the members of the household were sick at that time, and there was some speculation that they had been poisoned, perhaps by Lizzie. Most likely, though, that was not the case. They probably just ate some bad food or some bad fish. And doctors in that era refer to that as the summer disease or summer sickness, which was pretty common. People getting food poisoning from eating leftover meat or something like that. It had gone bad. After all, refrigeration did not exist in those days. People had, say, a block of ice to preserve their food. But so most likely there was no attempt to poison the Bordens. There were some other factors that did not make Lizzie Borden look very good in the eyes of townspeople or the law. For one thing, she burned a dress, which nowadays would be called destroying evidence, and it was documented that she did this. Also, some people in the town were struck by her iciness and calmness, but that may have been the result of the medication she was on to control her nerves. Why was the case such a media sensation, and why is it still a sensation to this day? It was simply hard for people to believe that in that Victorian era, that a woman so prim and proper, a proper English Protestant, would commit such a dastardly act. Lizzie Borden became a celebrity of sorts, not only in New England and Massachusetts, but throughout the country. Newspapers covered her every move. Now, when she was finally arrested and charged with the murders, Fall River had no facility for incarcerating female prisoners. So she was taken to the nearby town of Taunton, Massachusetts, and that's where she would remain during a pre-trial period and during the trial. Whenever she was transported by train from Fall River to Taunton or from Taunton to New Bedford, where the trial took place, people would gather on the train and stare at Lizzie Borden. She had become that much of a perverse celebrity.
Her trial was set for June 5, 1893, 9 months after the murders occurred. On June 1st, 5 days before the trial started, another axe murder occurred in Fall River. This time the victim was Bertha Manchester, who was found hacked to death in her kitchen. These similarities between the Manchester and Borden murders were striking. Jose Carreira de Melo, a Portuguese immigrant, was later convicted of Manchester's murder and was determined not to have been in the vicinity of Fall River at the time of the Borden murders.
At the trial, remember, jurors in those days, or juries I should say, were pretty much composed exclusively of men. And this was the case in the Lizzie Borden trial. 12 men were impaneled as jurors. Now what's interesting is that Lizzie Borden, with her money, could afford the best legal representation that money can buy. And her sister supported her during her trial. She believed her sister to be innocent. It so happened that one of the lawyers who represented Lizzie Borden was a man named George Robinson, who was a former governor of Massachusetts. And the judge who presided over the trial had been given his job initially by Governor George Robinson.
The prosecuting attorneys were Hosea Knowlton and future United States Supreme Court Justice William Moody. In addition to George Robinson, Lizzie Borden's defense team included Andrew Jennings and Melvin Adams.
If you recall earlier, I talked about the coroner's inquest in which Lizzie Borden made incriminating statements, but she made them without legal representation. That turned out to hurt the prosecution, not Lizzie Borden, because the judge at the trial deemed those statements inadmissible for two reasons. One, she had made them without legal representation, and two, her lawyers argued that she was under the influence of medication or drugs to the point during the inquest that she didn't know what she was saying. So that incriminating evidence, those holes in her story and so forth, were not admitted at the trial.
A prominent point of discussion in the trial and press coverage of it was the hatchet head found in the basement, which was not convincingly demonstrated by the prosecution to be the murder weapon. Prosecutors argued that the killer had removed the handle because it would have been covered in blood. One officer testified that a hatchet handle was found near the hatchet head, but another officer contradicted this. Though no bloody clothing was found at the scene, Alice Russell testified about seeing Lizzie burning a dress. The defense never challenged her statement, and it was never determined if the dress was the one she was wearing at the time of the murders. Lizzie claimed she burned the dress because it was covered in paint. Lizzie's presence at the home was also a point of dispute during the trial. According to testimony, Bridget Sullivan entered the second floor at around 10:58 a.m. and left Lizzie and her father downstairs. Lizzie told several people that at this time she went into the barn and was not in the house for 20 minutes or possibly half an hour. A man named Hyman Lubinsky testified for the defense that he saw Lizzie leaving the barn at 11:03 a.m., and Charles Gardner confirmed the time. At 11:10 a.m., Lizzie called Sullivan downstairs. She told her Andrew had been murdered and ordered her not to enter the room. Instead, Lizzie sent her to get a doctor. Both victims' heads had been removed during autopsy, and the skulls were admitted as evidence during the trial and presented on June 5, 1893. Upon seeing them in the courtroom, Lizzie fainted. The allegation that Lizzie attempted to purchase prussic acid from the local druggist on the day before the murders was excluded. Judge Justin Dewey ruled that the incident was too remote in time to have any connection. After the jury received its charge from Judge Dewey, it began deliberations on June 20th, 15 days after the trial started. After an hour and a half of deliberation, the jury acquitted Lizzie Borden of the murders. Upon exiting the courthouse, she told reporters she was, quote, the happiest woman in the world, unquote. Most likely, Lizzie Borden was guilty of murdering her father and stepmother. Either the prosecution failed to prove its case, or the jury simply let a guilty person go free, something that happens with regularity in American courtrooms, especially if the defendant has a good defense team. But if Lizzie Borden did not kill her parents, who did? One other suspect is John Morse, Lizzie's maternal uncle. Although he had not had much contact with his sister's family following her death, he had slept in the house the night before the murders and may have had a dispute with Andrew Borden over finances. Despite being a suspect initially and enduring the hostility of the local townspeople and the media, Morse's alibi was solid, and he was ruled out as a suspect. Then there was a man named William Borden, suspected to be Andrew's illegitimate son. He was noted as a possible suspect by author Arnold Brown, who surmised that William had tried and failed to extort money from his alleged father. But author Leonard Rebello, after doing extensive research on William, proved he was not Andrew's son. What about Emma Borden? Although Emma had an alibi at Fair Haven, about 15 miles from Fall River, crime writer Frank Spearing proposed in his 1984 book Lizzie that she might have secretly visited the residence to kill her parents, and then returned to Fair Haven in time to receive the telegram informing her of the murders. But the only people who believe Emma was guilty are hopeless conspiracy theorists who either watch too much TV or spend too much time trolling the internet. What about Bridget Sullivan? The Borden's live-in housekeeper was a 25-year-old Irish immigrant, and she was the only other person known to have been around the house at the time of the murders. The Bordens called her Maggie, which at the time was a common ethnic slur used against Irish Catholic women by upper-crust American Protestants like the Bordens. The Bordens, especially Andrew and Abby, made no effort to treat her as an equal. In his 1984 novel Lizzie, mystery author Evan Hunter suggested that Lizzie committed the murders after being caught in a romantic twist with Sullivan. Hunter speculated that Abby had caught the two together and had reacted with horror and disgust, and that Lizzie had killed Abby with a candlestick. She made a confession to Andrew when he returned home, but killed him in a rage with a hatchet when he reacted exactly as Abby had. He further speculated that Sullivan disposed of the hatchet somewhere afterwards. In her later years, Lizzie was rumored to be gay, but there was no such speculation about Sullivan, who later married a man she met while working as a maid in Butte, Montana. Sullivan died in Montana in 1948. Allegedly, she gave a deathbed confession to her sister, in which she stated that she had changed her testimony on the stand to protect Lizzie. But the idea that Lizzie and Bridget were lovers is based more on a titillating projection of contemporary cultural mores than actual fact. After the trial, the Borden sisters moved into a large modern house in the upscale Hill neighborhood of Fall River. Around this time, Lizzie began using the name Elizabeth A. Borden. At their new house, which Elizabeth dubbed Maplecroft, they had a staff that included live-in maids, a housekeeper, and a coachman. Because Abby was ruled to have died before Andrew, her estate went first to Andrew, and then at his death, passed to his daughters as part of his estate. A considerable settlement, however, was paid to settle claims by Abby's family. Lizzie was ostracized by Fall River society. Her name was again brought to the public eye when she was accused of shoplifting in Providence, Rhode Island in 1897. In 1905, shortly after an argument over a party that Elizabeth had given for actress Nance O'Neill, Emma moved out of the house and never saw her sister again. It is not known what Emma's true opinions were as to her sister's guilt. By the mid-1920s, Lizzie was ill, especially following the removal of her gallbladder. She died of pneumonia on June 1, 1927 in Fall River at age 66. Funeral details were not published and few people attended.
Well, after she was acquitted of her father and stepmother's murder, Lizzie Borden and her sister Emma inherited their family fortune. Although there are continuous whispers around town, and actually not whispers, and shouts of doubt as to whether or not she really was not guilty of these crimes, she stayed around Fall River and enjoyed a lavish lifestyle she did not live during her father's lifetime. She was involved in theater. She had close friendships and relationships with actors and any number of sort of individuals right here in Fall River in Massachusetts and throughout New England. As you might surmise, this is her final resting place. Now behind me, this is the Borden family lot. And there are several Borden family lots in this vicinity here in Fall River. But this one is mainly a monument to Lizzie's other relatives who were not accused murderers. In fact, Lizzie's grave, per her wishes, is one of these. It's so small and so decayed over time that I really can't surmise exactly which one it is. But it was her wish that she be buried next to her deceased father. And that was the wish that was granted.
9 days after Lizzie died, Emma died from chronic nephritis in a nursing home in Newmarket, New Hampshire, having moved there in 1923 for health reasons and to avoid renewed attention following the publication of another book about the murders. Neither of the Borden sisters ever married. At the time of her death, Lizzie Borden's estate was worth over $250,000, over $6 million today. The Lizzie Borden case has been called a Victorian melodrama. It offered a morbid look at high society. Then, as now, we are riveted when people in the upper classes are accused of committing a violent crime, a reflection of the covetous attitudes toward the wealthy. Legal historian Lawrence Friedman said that the Borden case ripped aside a curtain that covered and concealed a kind of dry rot, a concealed pathology, eating away at the pillars of respectable society. Others have said that the Borden case confirmed our worst fears about ourselves, whatever that means. In the few cases where women commit murder, poison, or another less violent method of killing was the most common method. It seemed inconceivable that a respectable woman would employ such a vicious method of murdering anyone, let alone her parents. The Borden case was also part and parcel of the advent of sensationalistic or yellow journalism. Journalists of that period were even more sensationalist-minded than they are today. Selling papers was the goal, not disseminating accurate information. For example, one outlet falsely reported that Lizzie was pregnant. That sold papers, but turned out not to be true and was recanted. The Borden case was one of the earliest trials that received widespread, constant newspaper coverage of the United States. They would even report on her facial expressions. The Lizzie Borden case has spawned a cottage industry of books, plays, and films. The number of books written about the case are too numerous to count, let alone start to name. The only film worth viewing is a 1975 made-for-television movie starring Elizabeth Montgomery, who is best known for the 1960 situation comedy Bewitched. An interesting coincidence. After Elizabeth Montgomery's death in 1995, it was discovered that she and Lizzie Borden were sixth cousins once removed, both descending from 17th century Massachusetts resident John Luther. The tourist industry in Fall River has benefited from the Borden case as well. In fact, I relied heavily on the Lizzie Borden house, which offers tours and serves as a bed and breakfast, in gathering information for this broadcast. And I especially thank the Lizzie Borden house's own Elena Mariani for her help with this project and for providing her voiceover talents.
Well, I hope you enjoyed this edition of Crime Chronicles. As we delve into the darker side of human nature, we invite you to join us on our journey by liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Your support helps make possible our inquiry into the sometimes unsettling but always fascinating phenomenon known as crime and justice. So hit that like and subscribe button right now and don't miss future episodes. Till then, Mark Jones, hoping you will join our Crime Chronicles community. And thanks for tuning in.